Hearts Place in Capitol Hill, a podcast brought to you by Six News. We're your hosts, Stuart Jeffrey and Leah Puglisi. Now, at the end of our last episode, way back in December, we spoke about next time doing the right to protest. This falls under the implied freedom of political communication, and people who've read Commonwealth Knowledge will know that I talk about that a lot. I think I've done 7 articles that have mentioned it. In this case, we're talking about Diana Violet Coco and some other protests being arrested over climate change and cost of living crises. And although some time has passed since the original arrest of Violet Coco, of course, we're coming up to her, I believe, an appeal later this month, even possibly. And joining us to discuss this now is Green Senator from New South Wales, David Shoebridge. Thanks for joining us today, Senator.
Yeah, pleasure, Stuart and Leo. Good to speak.
Now, I know you're putting forward a bill right now, or at least for this year, on enshrining the right to protest in legislation, because currently it's only done through the High Court. Just a bit of a rundown of what your bill is trying to do, and then we'll get to some of the details after that, I reckon. Just general overview, 30 seconds. What's it all about?
Yeah, well, we've seen an attack on the right to protest, which is a pretty fundamental political right, civil and political right, that many of us have taken for granted in a free and open democracy. We've seen a repeated series of attacks by state and territory governments, making it a crime to protest on a street, in a forest, to take climate action, to in any way disrupt fossil fuel activities, and seeing a series of laws that are actually putting protesters in jail, and not overnight or for a month, but some of these laws can see protesters spend 7 years in jail for an act of political protest. What we do see is we see just how close state and territory governments are to the extractive industries, the fossil fuel industries, the mining industries, the logging and forest industries. They're so close to those industries that they're literally responding to their demands on almost a monthly basis by passing new laws criminalising protest. So what we're attempting to do with the drafting of this bill and bringing it to the federal level is to raise it out of those state and territory political theatres and put it hopefully at a place where we can get a more principled view on the right to protest, and hopefully get a national minimum standard for the right to protest, which states can't then chip away at the next time they have a fossil fuel donor in their ear.
Yes, I believe the first thing that was properly discussed was actually involving former Greens Senator Bob Brown back in 2017 over logging protests in Tasmania. Of course, he fought that personally and succeeded in the High Court in getting protesters overturned in Tasmania for violating the implied freedom of political communication, because they restricted the right to protest. They went too far, the court said, and what they were aiming to do. Now, of course, I think the main one that you've been talking about from Twitter and also to others is about the climate change side of things. But of course, now we're seeing cost of living. I believe there was a protest just a couple of weeks ago. I believe it was Cherish, who was also locked up, or at least taken by the police and other protests. Can you just give us a quick discussion of what happened there with regards to her? Because, of course, Violet Coco is one everyone knows about for holding up traffic in New South Wales, but this is a more recent one and less well known in the media.
Yeah, well, Cherish is a student at Sydney University and was basically protesting the cost of living. And it turns out that these anti-protest laws can be used just as effectively on somebody protesting the obscene cost of living increases, the lack of affordable housing and social housing, the massive, I think, inexcusable rises in interest rates that people are facing. Turns out that the anti-protest laws can target those kinds of protests every bit as much as they can target climate protests. And, her matter is deeply troubling. It's still before the courts. So I probably can't talk about it, in terms of the substance of it in any great detail. But what we've seen is laws that are said to be used for A, to crack down on A. And when the laws were ground through the New South Wales Parliament, they were very clear. They wanted to jail climate protesters. But of course, it turns out they can be used for any political purpose that the government chooses. And in fact, we've seen those same laws being used to see a sentence passed in Violet Coco case where she was sentenced to, 18 months or so in jail for the crime of shutting down a couple of lanes of traffic on the Sydney Harbour Bridge for 2 hours. Well, actually for less than 2 hours. So this is a case in point that if you believe in the right to take political action and to do it on the streets, not just in parliaments, but on the streets, if you believe in the right to organise in your community and have a rally to protest against something or to demand some change, well, then you need to believe in everybody's right to protest. And we're talking about, peaceful protest. That's what we're talking about. You should believe in everybody's right to peaceful protest, whether it's a climate action you may not agree in, or a cost of living crisis, or it's something, that I might find politically offensive. The right in a free society to come together on our streets and to hold decision makers to account and demand change is something we should all cherish, but it is so at risk at the moment.
Yeah, certainly we saw during the COVID pandemic back in 2020, you saw lots of the BLM protests in winter of that year, and also since then, some of the anti-lockdown protests. And I definitely have seen some people, replying to you on Twitter, asking you, well, would you extend those same protections to anti-lockdown protesters under legislation?
Yeah, well, I think what we saw in the lockdown was really competing public interests. And this is why, crafting the bill to support the right to protest, it's not an unlimited right. So protesters readily accept that if they're blocking traffic and they go out and they choose to block traffic and they haven't got a permit, from police, and they go out and block traffic, then protesters accept that they can be charged with a traffic offence. And, blocking traffic is a traffic offence. You're a bit of but we don't want people just wandering out and blocking traffic left, right and centre. And if people are protesting and blocking traffic, well, then they are obviously willing to take on board a traffic offence. The problem with our anti-protest laws is for a crime of stopping traffic, they're being hit with an anti-protest offence, which is seeing them face 2 years in jail. You shouldn't face 2 years in jail because you're stopping traffic. What is being penalised here is the political action. So when we had the lockdown in place and we were very concerned about a pandemic, those pandemic laws should have been policed as pandemic laws. And policed under the pandemic laws. They weren't an excuse, and they shouldn't be used as an excuse to stop every single protest. And of course, that was challenged by, at different times, people out on the street protesting that Black Lives Matter, if you recall those protests as well. And I think increasingly what we're seeing conduct that has a degree of legal sanction against it. Maybe that's trespassing on a forest. Maybe that's trespassing in a bank's foyer. Maybe that's blocking a lane of traffic. Maybe that's slowing down a coal train. They all cause inconvenience. And protest often is designed to cause inconvenience. And it's one thing to accept a punishment for the inconvenience you cause at general law. And that may be being arrested and moved off and getting a $500 fine. Maybe it's been arrested and moved off if you've done it 20 times and getting a $2,000 fine, or facing a bail condition or something. But the idea that because you're doing it for a political reason, causing that inconvenience should be punished with 2 or 7 years in jail, and they're the kind of laws we're seeing. That's what's really offensive about the changes we've seen at a state and territory level. You're going to jail not because of the inconvenience you're causing. You're going to jail because you dared to cause inconvenience because you were deeply concerned about a political issue.
Protests have been seen quite a lot around Australia in the past few years, and we know when the initial laws passed the New South Wales Parliament was supported Coalition and Labor together. Of course, you and the Greens have made your stance very vocal federally and New South Wales. But can I ask, are you seeing much bipartisan, and not even just on the Parliament, just generally bipartisan support for backing, the right to protest and such, given that, parties like One Nation and the United Australia Party, who are represented in the Senate, have been very vocal when it comes to some of the anti-lockdown and anti-vaccine mandate protests. And it seems like regardless of the cause, the Greens, and it's a weird thing to say, but the Greens and One Nation are in agreement here, you know, the freedom to protest. Yeah. So are you seeing that bipartisanship on a minor party level?
Well, I haven't seen any moves by those right-wing parties to support the right to protest, despite their rhetoric. You know, they seem to very much support the right to protest on their political issues. But outside of that, they're very happy to see the heavy hand of the state come down and arrest somebody who's protesting for climate change. Very happy to see people being dragged out of forest by the police and put in jail and charged if they're protesting logging. So I get deeply troubled by politicians who say, I support the right to protest, but only if I politically agree with you. And I find that, you know, the libertarian right tends to have a deep thread of that, I think, incoherent politics. They support the right to protest, but only if they agree about what you're protesting about. I mean, I recall we had a person whose politics I disagree with markedly come to the Australian Parliament. He was quite a prominent campaigner against what he sees as, you know, excessive Chinese influence in Australia. He came to the Australian Parliament to meet with politicians. He wasn't meeting with me. He was meeting with right-wing politicians. And he was literally arrested and marched out of the place by the Australian Federal Police because they feared that he might cause a disruption. There was no evidence he was going to cause a disruption. He just wanted to come and talk to politicians, as was his right, in the centre of democracy. And, you know, I called out the AFP's actions in that regard. It was a deep overreach by the AFP. No one should be prevented from peacefully coming to no Australian citizen should be prevented from coming to the Australian Parliament to talk to politicians about matters that they care about. And the police should not be intervening to do it. And it doesn't really, you know, unless they're actively promoting deep hate and division or violence or that. I mean, there are limits to free speech, and I support us having limits on that. But if they're coming to peacefully engage with politicians on a matter that they're passionate about, what the bloody hell is going wrong with our country when they get arrested by the police?
Right. I was just going to say, I know Stuart wants to ask a question, but just to elaborate on that, you said there are, you know, politicians on all sides of the spectrum concerned by this. To confirm, does that extend to the major parties, Labor, National, Liberals, who obviously, again, on a New South Wales state level, that protest bill was passed?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I won't speak out of school, but I was in the state parliament. It was one of the last weeks or so that I was in the New South Wales state parliament when those laws passed, and there were, I know, members of the Labor Party who were deeply conflicted about having to vote for those laws, and in fact, almost to a person, the union movement in New South Wales opposed those laws and called on the Labor Party not to support them. But nevertheless, because of the power of the fossil fuel lobby and because of what they saw as the political inconvenience of supporting someone who blocked traffic one day, Labor just lined up with the coalition and voted those laws through en masse. It was a deeply unsightly surrender of political principle. But as it was happening, there were absolutely, you know, some good people inside the Labor Party who were, you know, dreadfully conflicted by it and didn't want to see it happen.
Now, because we're talking here about, you know, freedom of speech, and of course that often will bring up, you know, people's understandings of US First Amendment, and of course that's been opposed by a lot of Australians, going to the US style of freedom of speech. But of course, going back as early as 2013, the High Court said, well, you know, it's more about equality opportunity to participate in democracy. How would you agree with, or would you agree with that characterization of the right to protest as being more about participation than it is so much the US style freedom of speech?
Well, you know, I'm probably on the libertarian fringe of the Greens. I support the right to freedom of speech. The constraint I would put on freedom of speech is where it's actually intended to cause harm to people or to put people's lives or threaten people. You know, I think that's you haven't got a freedom to go out and threaten people or to incite racial vilification. I think there are some reasonable bounds to put on freedom of speech, but they're very modest limitations, and of course the laws that we've seen passed go so far beyond those. But you know, I think that is a worthwhile conversation to have. I think there are people in the United States who see, for example, our anti-vilification laws as some sort of evil government intervention. I disagree with that. I wouldn't support a completely unlimited right to the freedom of speech. And that's one of the issues we're grappling with in drafting this bill. We don't want to undermine those socially accepted norms that we have, that it's inappropriate to vilify someone for race or religion. I mean, that should remain, that should remain sanctioned by the law. Well, there should be a legal sanction if you go out and seek to do that. And that's, I think, I think that there's a very different debate on freedom of speech in Australia. But of course, the High Court has found that there's some implied right to political freedom in our constitution. They were in a bit of an expansive frame of mind a couple of decades ago when they looked at this, because it's not, you don't have a right to political communication that jumps out at you from the constitution. Yeah. What the High Court, I think, if you take the constitution into a dark corner of the room and look at it in candlelight and you sort of peer at it, you can read into it an implied right to political communication. And I support that. I think it's a good thing they did. And what they said is basically the Constitution is founded on a functional democracy. And if you haven't got a functional democracy, the Constitution doesn't work. And therefore you can't have governments pass such oppressive laws that they prevent an open political debate from happening. So it's a limitation on what governments can do. It's not really an express freedom given to individuals, and it's had some effect, but I think a very modest effect. And many of these state laws are still stepping through the process of a High Court challenge.
Yes, that reminds me kind of the Supreme Court decision, Brandenburg in Ohio, which of course is semi-famous because it involves the old saying, shouting fire in a crowded theatre. But they said, basically, if it doesn't incite lawless action, and I think that's a good understanding to take here. Now, of course, we have seen lots of what you'd say are bad decisions when it comes to protest laws, but then, of course, there's other ones which might be more in line with what you're proposing. I believe there was a decision more recently, Edward, where they were looking at protest laws surrounding abortion clinics and, treating people who are going to those clinics to get an abortion. How can protesters treat it? Is it a harassment or is it protected by freedom of speech?
Yeah, and of course, that's another, it's another good illustration. I'm glad you brought it up, Stuart, about where there are reasonable limits on an untrammeled right to freedom of speech. I don't think people have a right to simply scream at people and abuse people as they're entering into a reproductive health centre to consider a termination. I mean, it's already a deeply emotional and difficult decision for people. And the idea that some small section of community feels they have a license to abuse people and harass them as they're going about and seeking health services, I think the majority of Australians reject that. And laws, a reasonable law that provides a buffer zone and protects people from that when they're accessing those services, is one of those reasonable constraints on the right to protest and freedom of speech. And I think that makes us a more civil society. And there is another 99.9999999% of the country where people can, protest if they wish on abortion laws and make those claims. But they should not be permitted to do it and harass people when they're seeking a medical service. And I think those are the, if you like, the examples that point out why an untrammeled right like the United States has would not work and wouldn't be appropriate in Australia. But on the other hand, I think most people would also say you shouldn't go to jail for 7 years because you happen to interfere for 10 minutes with the loading of a coal train because you're worried about coal destroying the climate. You can probably hear the bells. Sorry, Stuart.
Yeah. I was wondering what that was. I'm like, is there a doorbell outside? No.
It's got at least it gives a real life. This actually is happening from Senate. So
I have been waiting. I see this on every news channel. This is the first time it's happened on 6 News. So you've made it first. Enjoy the Senate.
Sure. Thanks for being here.
Yes. Bye.